Hello and welcome to the American Museum of Tort Law's video series. I'm your host, Rick Newman, Executive Director of the museum. Following the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police on May 25th, 2020, we have seen, and in many cases, many of us have experienced massive protests against racism, police misconduct, and police violence. This in turn has triggered more episodes of police violence and disproportionate responses from militarized police, who in many cases act as though they are occupying forces in hostile territory rather than public servants whose mission is to protect and serve. We as a nation must now confront this issue of police violence and how we can reduce the incidence of this violence and both weed out those who should not serve as police officers while holding them accountable for the injuries and loss of life that they have caused. We have a very special program today for two reasons. First, our guest is Professor Deborah Ramirez, who teaches at Northeastern University School of Law in Boston. Second, because this is actually the second time we are filming this, since for some reason it only halfway recorded last time. So Professor Ramirez has very kindly agreed to give me a second try at this, and hopefully we'll get it right. In any event, Deborah Ramirez is a nationally known expert on community policing and racial profiling. She has spoken on the issue, written on it, and is a leader in new approaches in reining in out-of-control police. Recently, she and two of her students, Marcus Wright and Mitchell Kosht, wrote an important paper in the American Journal of Criminal Law called Policing the Police: Could Mandatory Professional Liability Insurance for Officers Provide a New Accountability Model? Here with us today to discuss the problems of police violence and possible solutions is Professor Deborah Ramirez. Thank you very much, Professor Ramirez.
My pleasure.
Well, let's first of all start. We've all seen the news for the last several weeks of police violence. What are the current barriers to holding police accountable for their misconduct?
Well, I've asked that question, and I'm sure many of your listeners have had that question. So there are several barriers. First of all, I went to my police chief, Billy Evans, to ask him about this, and he said, here are the barriers. And many police chiefs have echoed his complaint. He said, police chiefs cannot hire the officers they want to hire. And of course, the best way to keep dangerous, reckless police officers from policing is not to hire them in the first instance. He said, the legislature and the unions require me to hire the people who get the highest civil service exam grade. He said, I can't discipline them because the unions have negotiated a disciplinary process called arbitration that they pretty much control. And when I discipline someone, 2/3 of the time the arbitrators overturn me. Third, I can't terminate them. I said, well, if you can't terminate them, he goes, what about promotion? He said, well, that is also civil service. I have to promote people not based on who was the best community policing officer, but based on who got the test score. I said, in termination? He said, oh, it's almost impossible to fire a police officer because of union restrictions. I said, what do you do? He said, I put them on the front desk, which is the rubber room of policing. So the police chiefs may not discipline or fire the officers. So that is one impediment.
What role, if any, do the police unions play?
Well, the police unions have been very effective at negotiating with municipalities about these issues. So as part of their collective bargaining agreements, they've negotiated an agreement with most cities that says that it limits oversight discipline, requiring that there be arbitrators and that they control the arbitration process. It limits termination, and this is very important for your listeners. it also requires the cities to pay the costs relating to misconduct. So if after Eric Gardner was strangled by Daniel Pantaleo, the family sues, which they did, they would get, and they did get, a $5 million verdict. Now, who pays that? Well, the unions have negotiated with the cities to say that the cities are required to pay 100% of the costs relating to any misconduct, including giving them paid leave while under investigation and paying all legal fees. So another impediment to deterring reckless policing is that when the police are sued and a judgment or settlement is entered, in 99% of the cases, the officer pays nothing. The
So,
municipality pays and they bill the taxpayers. So let me give you three numbers that are important here.
mhm.
In Chicago, they paid $350 million over 8 years for police misconduct. In New York, they paid $384 million over 5 years for police misconduct. And in Minneapolis, a single suit by an Australian woman who was murdered by a police officer when she called the police, said there was something going on in her alleyway. When she went to meet them, she was shot. That family got $20 million. Who pays that? The taxpayers. And the city attorneys who have to pay these bills for police misconduct have been very explicit in saying what that means. So a Chicago city attorney who had to pay the $350 million over 8 years for police misconduct out of Chicago's budget said this: when you have to budget more for police tort liability, you have less to do lead poisoning screening for the poor children in Chicago. We had a terrible lead poisoning problem, and there was a direct relationship between the two. Those kids were paying those tort judgments, not the police officers and not the police department.
So the situation, if I understand it then, is that a cop commits a murder, for example, is sued and ends up paying nothing. Instead, the city, and therefore the taxpayers, pay whatever settlement or verdict is returned. Is that right?
Yes, 99% of the time, the officer pays nothing. The police department pays nothing. It's the municipality, the city.
And at the same time, the cop can't be fired, cannot be fired.
It's almost impossible. So let's just give an example of this. Eric Garner, you remember, he was selling single cigarettes in New York. And the police officer who murdered him with an illegal chokehold by strangling him to death was Daniel Pantaleo. And that incident occurred in 2014. When I met his mother, Gwen Carr, she said to a panel of all of us who were in Washington, D.C., she said, look at all the experts on policing in this room. She said, I want to ask one question. Why is it that Daniel Pantaleo, the police officer who murdered my son, is still on the police force 4 years later and still getting paid? And I knew part of the answer. I didn't know all the answers. And I said, I'm going to write a law review article about why he's still on the force and why it's so hard to fire a police officer even after he strangles someone to death. And I wrote that article and I sent it to you. It's the article that I wrote with two amazing law students, Mitchell Kosht and Marcus Wright. They're now both attorneys. Marcus is an attorney in Maine and Mitchell is an attorney here in Boston. And with their help, we wrote that article. And once I wrote it, I went back to Washington, D.C. for another conference, and Gwen Carr was there, and I gave her the article and I said, this is your answer. Now, What's interesting about that case is Daniel Pantaleo himself. At the time that he strangled Eric Garner, he had more sustained civilian complaints than 98% of the New York police force. He was in the top 2% of sustained complaints. And that's New York. He had 3 civil lawsuits filed against him by the time before he strangled Eric Garner. In one, the city had already settled the suit. It was an illegal strip search. In another, there was a federal suit pending for false arrest, and there was another strip search lawsuit pending in federal court. He also had 2 prior disciplinary actions against him, which resulted in discipline. Now, with all of that, even before he strangled Eric Garner, he was still on the force.
Right.
And then he strangled Eric Garner and stayed on the force for 5 more years. That's how bad and broken the system is.
Okay, so it's a system that needs a solution. We can't fire the bad cops, and they're not personally paying any of the judgments against them, which is where you come in with your proposal. Tell us about this idea.
Okay, first of all, I don't think of these police officers as bad cops necessarily. There are a lot of honorable and good people who go into policing, and many of these police officers have substance abuse disorder problems, mental illness, trauma, PTSD. There are a lot anger management issues. So they may not be bad people, but they're engaging in reckless conduct. And if we knew about their problems earlier on, we could have prevented, detected, and deterred a strangling or a killing, and we might have been able to help them address those problems with treatment. So here is my solution. Just as drivers have to have insurance in order to drive, police would have to have insurance in order to police. And just as reckless drivers with dangerous records can be priced out of driving by high premiums, officers who've engaged in reckless or dangerous behavior should be priced out of policing by high premiums that reflect the actual risk they pose. In my system, the police department would pay the average officer base premium. If there are any increases because of individual behavior, individual reckless and dangerous behavior, then that increase, the difference between the average and what this officer is assessed, would be paid by the officer. Now, it is a carrot and stick approach because when the insurance company finds out, let's say, that an officer has driving under the influence conviction, a domestic violence restraining order, or that year they were convicted of assault, their premium would go up, they would be notified, and they would also be told, you know, you have a DUI. If you went to Alcoholics Anonymous or another program that had some validity to it, you could get good points and reduce your premium. So we're trying to have not just a punitive approach, but a carrot and stick approach.
All right, and so then, if I understand it correctly, what would happen is a policeman or policewoman, a police officer, who has some sort of disciplinary problems or other violations, drunk driving, spousal abuse, whatever it might be, would be rated by the insurance company, and his or her insurance rates for practicing as a police officer would go up.
Correct. So insurance companies do what they call risk assessment algorithms. And they could create for every officer a risk assessment scorecard. And we all know what the early warning indicators are. So they would look at things like, has this person been involved in a prior civil rights lawsuit that was settled or went to judgment? Do they have any criminal conviction, including a domestic violence restraining order? Um, how many sustained civilian complaints do they have? And although this would be weighted much less, what's the total number of civilian complaints? Um, do they have an unjustified use of force report? Have they had prior disciplinary proceedings in which discipline was found and administered? Is there an unjustified discharge of a weapon, and how many times was their weapon discharged? Because many police officers go their whole career without discharging their service weapon. So these are indicators. Let's apply this to what happened in Minneapolis. Derek Chauvin had 18 prior complaints. He was the officer who murdered George Floyd. And he had 2 prior disciplinary actions. And he had 3 shooting incidents. In 2006, he was on the scene when a suspect was shot and killed. It was investigated by a grand jury. The grand jury refused to indict. In 2008, he opened fire on Latrell Toles, who was locked in his bathroom. In 2011, he was on the scene when another suspect was shot. From an actuarial point of view, these are indicators of reckless policing. He was with an officer named Thao, T-H-A-O, who had 6 complaints. Also in 2017, he had an excessive use of force lawsuit that was settled by the city for $25,000. Now, again, from an actuarial standpoint, this is very risky person to insure because they've already engaged in excessive use of force. It's already been found and went to judgment. So this system is meant to prevent, detect, and deter. It's meant to identify early on who are officers who are engaged in dangerous and reckless behaviors. And it is meant to be calibrated. So if this is your first driving under the influence, is it possible that you could get treatment for an alcohol problem and remediate? Now, let's suppose that the officer says, I'm not doing it. Well, then their premiums go up and they get priced out, but at least they had a chance, right? And there are some officers, for a variety of reasons, who are not going to accept treatment. They won't even accept the fact that they have a problem. Well, they need to find a different occupation than policing.
And if this system had been in place, it sounds like these 2 officers in Minneapolis would not have been policing, because
So they would never have met George Floyd.
right.
I'll give you another example. Jason Van Dyke is the officer in Chicago who killed Laquan McDonald. At the time, he had 20 complaints, placing him in the top 3% of the officers. And most importantly, he had an excessive use of force lawsuit, which the city settled for $350,000. Now, from an actuarial point of view, that insurance company would have looked at that way before he killed and said, this is not someone we feel comfortable insuring. We've already paid out $350,000. It may well be that the premium will go sky high and Jason Van Dyke would have been priced out of policing, which would have been better for him and better for Laquan McDonald.
And earlier today, when we were doing this the first time, you mentioned an analogy, I guess, to a physician friend of yours who talked about medical malpractice.
Well, yes. It turns out one of my neighbors is a doctor, and he saw an op-ed I wrote for the Boston Globe on this issue. And he said, Debbie, it would be wonderful if I, as a doctor, could get the taxpayers to pay for all of my mistakes and malpractice. Can I get that deal? And I laughed. And he said, but it's not funny. He said, doctors have to carry malpractice insurance. And if I or my colleague botches a surgery, then my premiums go up. And if I keep doing it, I'm priced out of medicine. He said, the system that you describe in which the taxpayers are paying, he said, I am paying for police misconduct, seems terribly wrong. And, he said he doesn't understand why, if he has to carry professional liability insurance, officers can't do the same.
Well, and that leads to my next question. It sounds like existing system, the taxpayers pay rather than the police officer who committed the tort, the assault or the murder.
Correct.
And the police officer who committed the tort, the assault or the murder, remains a police officer. Under your proposal, the market evaluates their conduct and prices their insurance accordingly, so that officers who engage repeatedly in bad conduct get priced out, they're off the force, and the victims still get compensated for their wrongdoing. It sounds like a better system. So
It is, you know, obviously from the plaintiff tort litigation bar perspective, they may well like the fact that cities are paying for the settlements because plaintiffs should be compensated, and it's a very good compensation system for plaintiffs. But in torts, as you know, it's a matter of not just compensating the victims, but also deterring, both specific deterrence of that person and general deterrence of others similarly situated. And that's what's not happening. We still want victims to be compensated, and they will be, just the way that when my neighbor, who's a doctor, botches a surgery, the victims are compensated. They're compensated by his insurance policy. And similarly, if all officers carried personal liability insurance, all victims would be compensated by the officer's insurance policy instead of by the municipality and the taxpayers. So victims would still be compensated. The difference is the insurance companies now would have an economic incentive to try to figure out and identify who the officers are who are already engaging in reckless and dangerous behavior, which is a precursor to more dangerous and reckless behavior. Now, just as a driver, if you, for example, got a bill for your insurance and you said, oh my gosh, they raised my premium and it's so unfair, you would have due process. In Massachusetts, there's this obscure board called the Board of Appeals for Motor Vehicle Policies and Bonds. It's an administrative board, almost every state has it. And if your premium goes up, you go to that board and you say, really unfair. And the board looks at what the insurance company did and determines, was it arbitrary and capricious or was it fair? You get more process than that, because even if you lose at the administrative board, you can go to a judge, and a judge will determine whether the administrative board was arbitrary and capricious in upholding the insurance company, or whether there was a basis for them to find that your premiums were high. So if you went there and they said, well, the reason they raised your premiums is because you hit 3 civilians, and we also paid out 2 prior lawsuits for you for driving under the influence, and you had another driving under the influence. And so they might say, well, I think there was a basis for the insurance company to raise your premium. And even if you didn't agree, you could still go to court. But a judge might say, you know, it looks like the behavior that you engaged in is reckless and dangerous, and you should not continue driving. And similarly, you would set up a procedure like that for the police.
So this would, in effect, deter bad future behavior, not only by the officer with the prior record, but it would also serve as a warning to other police officers to straighten up and fly right.
Right. And as I said, if the problem is the officer has a domestic violence restraining order, which is a serious, serious thing, maybe anger management treatment would be appropriate. And it may well be that this is the catalyst for getting that treatment that the officer didn't want to believe he or she needed. Maybe the officer who gets a DUI has an alcohol problem. And this is an opportunity early on, before a shooting or strangling, for the officer to get the treatment that they would need to address the problem. And similarly, if they have an assault conviction because they got in a bar fight, it's an indication maybe they need anger management training. Right. But we need to begin not simply to say, once the shooting occurs or the strangling, we got to fire them. Yes, we do. We've got to make sure that the victims get compensated. Yes, we do. But that is after the fact. What we really need to do is to provide the kind of accountability that's going to prevent, detect, and deter.
Good. And so what is the next step? What are the barriers to getting this done? How is it done at the federal level, the state level? How do we get this to happen?
Okay, at the state level, every person who's listening needs to go to their state legislators and ask them to do two things. First, the first thing that we're asking state legislators to do is to restrict the parameters of collective bargaining. Each state decides what is the arena in which collective bargaining can occur. What can you collectively bargain about? And with respect to police unions, we want them to say, you, as a matter of public policy, you may no longer collectively bargain about hiring, firing, discipline, promotion, or the allocation of the costs of police misconduct. And we, as a matter of public policy, prohibit municipalities and police departments from indemnifying these officers. That changes the status quo. We don't pay the bill anymore. Then we want to make sure victims are compensated. So we also ask the state legislature to pass a law that says, just as drivers have to have insurance to drive, just as doctors have to have professional liability insurance in order to practice medicine, police officers need personal liability insurance in order to police. That's what needs to happen at the state level. Now, the impediment is that the police unions are going to fight this tooth and nail. They like the status quo. They have an excellent deal here where the police chief can't discipline them, hire them, fire them, terminate them, and if they engage in misconduct, we pay the bill. Mm-hmm. That's a good system for them, and they're going to resist any change. At the federal level, we have asked Congress to amend 42 USC 1983. That's the statute that people like Gwen Carr file suit under when her son is killed by the police, strangled. Mm-hmm. And we want to amend it to say, neither municipalities nor police departments may indemnify officers who have violated this statute. And we want it to also say, and officers who police need to have professional liability insurance.
Problem solved. Have you spoken to any insurance companies? Is there any understanding, willingness on their part? Do they seem to think that this is doable?
I've talked to actuaries and insurance. In several insurance journals and insurance reporting services have picked up on this and thought of this as an interesting new market. One of the actuaries said, this is what we do, we assess risk. And we have risk assessment algorithms that do this. We are in the business of doing this. They had one article, it said, send in the actuaries.
So it sounds though like it's got some legislative hurdles to get over.
Yes.
Getting the states to approve the language that you just outlined.
Yes.
But it sounds like it's very workable.
I think it is. You know, for those who don't think it is, you know, go tell my neighbor, the doctor, why it is that we can require him to have insurance. And we have a whole system to deal with it, but we can't do it for police. Because he would like to know.
Yeah.
He said, I have to carry insurance. And if I screw up, I pay for it. And if I keep screwing up, I'm priced out. He doesn't understand why we can't do the same thing for police officers.
Right.
I agree.
Well, the whole idea of the system as it is now is it allows the officers who have done bad things.
Yes.
To escape accountability.
Yes, there's no accountability in our system right now. None. And that's the police department is not accountable for them, and neither is the officer accountable for those damages. And the next article I write is going to be called The Roadmap to Accountability. And it's going to set out exactly what I said here. Here are the steps, and here's what we need to do. And we need to do that. Even if we defund and dismantle police like they did in Camden, you're still going to have a core and maybe narrower police force to respond to rapes, burglary, bank robberies, terrorism, active shootings. You still need accountability for those police functions.
Good. Well, Professor Ramirez, this has been very informative, very helpful. I think take two is great. So thank you again for taking the time to talk with us today. I really appreciate it. Deborah Ramirez, Professor of Law at Northeastern University School of Law in Boston, Massachusetts. Thank you again.
My pleasure.